For our program today, we're going to trace that history from 1917 to 1969. So that's kind of the classic era of jazz as popular music here in the United States. And I want to get started with the first slide. So the first jazz that you see, the term jazz showing up in the Sioux City newspapers and in other sources is in 1917, and I don't think that's an accident. So jazz as a musical form began around the turn of the 20th century in New Orleans, and it was very specifically, it came out of minstrel music that had been played since the 1840s and ragtime music that had become popular in the 1880s and 1890s, and then, of course, mixed with just special things that were going on in New Orleans at the time. It gradually developed as a form, and certainly the originators of jazz were African Americans, and also mixed Creole people in New Orleans, and that is important to be. That's important to note. It's based in the blues. What really set it apart as something new was the idea of syncopation, and now I love music. I do not have a musical bone in my body. But basically syncopation is multiple rhythms playing at the same time. And of course, this is one of the funnest things I had in this was as going through the sources, how people just hated jazz. People love jazz and they hated it. And so there's all kinds of fun articles about how jazz is ruining the world and that hopefully it's going to die. I probably saw 100 articles that were titled "Jazz on its way out" or "Jazz is about to die." And they were so happy with that. And this is in the 1920s. And so that was great. And it just reminded me, of course, same things were said about rock and roll in the 1950s and early 1960s. Same thing was said about punk music in the 70s and rap music in the 1980s. I mean, it's always been that way, especially us older folks tend to hate the stuff our kids like, so, and vice versa. But the first mention of jazz here in Sioux City is in 1917, and I think that is connected. I think there's a specific reason for that. In 1917, the original Dixieland Jazz Band put out the first recorded jazz music in April of 1917, and it became a sensation. And now that band was all white guys. They were from New Orleans, but they were all mostly Italian, from Italian-American stock, and it took people by storm. And so what's funny about the first band that's really active here in Sioux City is Dawson's Jazz Band. This is Charles Dawson. And Charles Dawson, he had a band that had been playing in Sioux City for a while before 1917. And I imagine it was a standard jazz band. Maybe they were playing some ragtime and whatever. But as soon as the term jazz caught on, they called themselves Dawson's Jazz Band. And they were playing all the time. And at that time, a really active place was over at Crystal Lake in South Sioux City. The lake was much more than it is today. And they had some very developed resorts and a dance pavilion. And so there were dances going on all the time. And keep in mind, dancing was such an important form of entertainment from the 19-teens all the way through into the 1960s, where it was cheap entertainment that you could do all the time. And so people just did a lot of dancing during this era, and jazz music is very much a part of that. Now, here's another place that Dawson's Jazz Band would play was at Sioux City's auditorium at the time. Unfortunately, we just recently lost this building at the southwest corner of 7th and Douglas Streets, but this was built in 1909 as the auditorium, and that was a very active place for the playing of live music at that time, and it will figure into the story later, too, as a different venue. Now, another thread to the story, as I said, jazz was very much an African-American invention. And it just coincides that during, like a lot of northern cities, the 19-teens, especially the World War I era between 1914 and 1918, was when African Americans began to move into Sioux City in fairly large numbers to work in the stockyards and meatpacking industries and other manufacturing interests. And with that came musicians. And so one of the early African American Sioux City bands was James Walker's jazz band. And you'll notice they were going to play at the Knights of Columbus Hall. And this was at 5th and Pierce Streets, and it's this building right here. And it was very common in those days, the various organizations, as part of their building, would have a meeting hall or a dance hall. And so a lot of these dances in the 20s and 30s occurred at places like this. So in the upper floors of the Knights of Columbus, that's where they were having a dance, being played by Walker's Jazz Orchestra. Now, here's a little bit different setting. So this is a Christmas party in 1918 at the Martin Ballroom. So the Martin Hotel at 4th and Pierce Streets at the northeast corner of 4th and Pierce. And as you can see, this was the 100 Club, kind of a fancy dance club at that time. And there were all kinds of these at that time. And they're being, the players are Durfee's Jazz Orchestra. Now, Earl Durfee had been playing around Sioux City since at least 1900, and of course he had to add jazz to his title too. So by 1918 they were the Durfee's jazz band. Now here we have an interesting thing. Right at the end of World War II, a lot of course, all military units had bands, had marching bands, and that was a long tradition in the military. And especially during service in World War I, they met people from other parts of the country, particularly from the South and maybe from New Orleans. And people that were playing band music found out they liked jazz and they liked to play jazz. And so it's funny, by 1919, the band from the 163rd Depot Brigade from Camp Dodge down in Des Moines, they had a nifty jazz band by the end of the war. And so they came to Sioux City in 1919 and they played at what was called the Gaiety Theater. And in this picture, I didn't have a picture when it was the Gaiety. It was originally the Sioux City's first Orpheum Theater. And it was at 615 5th Street. It was right across the street, right where the parking lot is north of our building on the east side of the alley. That's where that building was. It later was the Rialto Theater. And so that was a traveling act that was playing jazz music early on here in Sioux City. Now here's a kind of an interesting little place. So this is William Perry's Jazz Orchestra, another black resident of Sioux City that had a long-standing live band here in Sioux City. And they played regularly at the Princess Cafe. So this is the Princess Theater, which was at 412 Jackson Street, which was right across the street from us where the parking ramp is today. And you can see the Princess Cafe was this little, so this was a live theater and later a motion picture theater. But in the kind of down a stairwell was the Princess Cafe, and William Perry's or jazz band played there all the time. So that was a little hot spot. Now, another place a lot of music was played was at the West Hotel. The West Hotel was at 3rd and Nebraska Streets. It was so it'd be the northeast corner or northwest corner, and that was the I have that wrong on the picture, so it'd be the northwest corner, and where the Central Bank parking lot is today. And at this time, the Earl Roberts Orchestra was playing there, and they were another of Sioux City's African-American bands that were playing at kind of a fancy cocktail lounge that they had there. Now, probably the first major recording star that was known for jazz music was Blossom Seeley, who came to Sioux City. Not the first in overall, but the first kind of prominent national figure identified with jazz. And what's funny is Blossom Seeley had been around before there was before jazz was popular music, but she adopted this new form and she was pretty good at it, and she had a very successful recording career during the 1920s. And so she was known as the Queen of Jazz. That's how she was advertised. And she came to play at what was called the Orpheum Vaudeville at that time. So by that point, by 1921, actually in about 1918, the Orpheum moved from north of our building to a theater that was almost exactly where we're sitting right now. They called it the Orpheum Vaudeville originally. Later it was the Capitol Theater. And so she played at that theater in 1921. Now, here's a kind of a different place that music was played. This is the Labor Temple, and this is at 6th and Pearl Streets. And it was a 4-story building. Today, there's a 3-story building, and I think it's a different structure than this, not a remodeled version, but it may be. It was called the Purslow Block. And the various labor unions controlled basically the upper floors of this building, and that was another place that live music was played and was known for jazz. And so at this point, Earl Krell's orchestra was going to play a dance being held there. Now, the first purpose, well, not the first, but one of the first really prominent live dance venue was just to the north of us on the roof of the Commerce Building it'd be the southwest corner of 6th and Nebraska Streets. And that was Tom Archer's Roof Garden. Tom Archer was from Des Moines, and he was known as the Ballroom King of Iowa. And he owned and ran ballrooms in Sioux City and Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, all around the state. And so he ended up over the years running several ballrooms in Sioux City. And the first big one was the Roof Garden. And what they did is they built the penthouse that's on the roof to this day, that we have the line pointing at, and that was purpose-built as a dance hall and a place to play music. And so that was built in 1922, and in 1923, one of their regular act that was there was Bill Ackerman's Jazz Orchestra from Omaha, and they were known for easygoing jazz. Which means to me is that they're probably more of a traditional dance band, but they jazzed it up a little bit enough to make fast dancing fun. But all kinds of people played at the Roof Garden over the years. Now, here's maybe my favorite, just kind of odd. So the Home Protection Council Orchestra. The Home Protection Council was basically an insurance organization. So to protect your home, it was like a house insurance place. But they had an orchestra because everybody had to have an orchestra in those days. And so they had, and they played jazz. They were known for that. I also like their their instrument ensemble. They have a piano, a violin, a banjo, and a saxophone. And so, it's just, I kind of try to imagine the kind of sound they made. It was really kind of fun. But they were playing a concert at what was called the Modern Woodmen of America. So from Omaha, the big insurance organization, had Woodman's Hall, which was in the upper floors of the Lurch Block. And this is where Gooseman Law Firm is today, owns this building in the Lurch Block on 5th Street, on the north side of 5th Street. So that was another place that you'd see a lot of dances and things going on back in the 1920s. Now, Eddie Bunt and his Wolverines, they were a really active band in Sioux City for years. And in fact, they were kind of Sioux City's first local radio stars. And Eddie Bunt was always usually the leader of the bands in those days, were the oldest guy in the picture. And so Eddie Bunt is the piano player kind of right here. And over the years, all kinds of local young guys played for him in his orchestra and got their start in music. And so WEAU, that was Sioux City's first commercial radio station. It started in 1922, and it was owned by the Davidson Brothers Department Store, which was over at 4th and Pierce Street at the southwest corner where Great Southern Bank is today. And the Davidsons got a radio license, and they didn't really know what to do with it, and so they advertised their store. And in those days, there wasn't a big. Everybody was trying to figure out what the heck to do with radio to make people want to listen. And so one of the things they would do all through the 20s and the 30s was local groups would play all kinds of music, and of course, jazz was one of the favorites. And so these local groups would go on the radio and play during their allotted slots throughout the week, and and then later they would add national shows and things, but that's what they were doing. And so I'm clicking backwards, so and that radio station was right in the Davidson's department store, and for a while. That radio station will figure into the story here in a little bit, but that's kind of how radio jazz started in Sioux City. Now, probably at this time, Sioux City's most famous band was the Monaghan Post American Legion Band. And this had formed right after World War I, and the Monaghan Post was the American Legion post for the west side of Sioux City, and named after Edward Monaghan, who was the first local person killed in World War I. And so they were a big military band, and they became the official American Legion Band in the late 1920s and were that through World War II. But the guys in the Monahan Post, they like jazz too. And so in 1926, they were playing a concert out in Pennsylvania, and there was enough of interest in playing some jazz music at their amongst the guys in the band that Don Reitz led specifically a jazz section of their performance. And Reitz came back to Sioux City, and he really had his orchestra just on the side, was probably the most popular local orchestra through the 20s into the early 1930s. And so he was very much identified with jazz music here in Sioux City. And in this case, he had just won. They had in 1924, there was a contest to who was the best local jazz band, and Don Reitz's band won the trophy that you see here. Now, of course, we always think of jazz connected to Prohibition, since its rise to popularity kind of occurred during the Prohibition era in the 1920s. And so this is a fun thing I came across. So this was the Castle on the Hill. It's not Central High School like most of us think. It was a big house that was out just to the east of Riverside in the Highland Park area, just off of what today is West 19th Street. It's on what's called California Street to this day. And it was a big house that had been built by William Byam, one of the founders of Riverside back in the 1880s and 1890s. And by this point, it was what they called a roadhouse. And so it was a restaurant, and it was not supposed to be a bar, but it was basically a speakeasy. And in 1924, Officer Jerry O'Connor led a raid, and what he found, first off, he found a local African-American jazz band playing, and people were having a good time, and they busted like the 25 people that were there and closed it down for a while. It was called the Silver Cliff Inn at that point. Now, so jazz music at this point was very much identified with dancing, and particularly fast dancing. And by the end of the 1920s, it'd be identified with the Charleston, for instance. At this time, they usually called them foxtrots, but I think that was an older term that they used it. But a lot of times, jazz groups would, especially the bigger bands, would travel with dancers. And a dancing team that came to national prominence was actually from Sioux City. It was Elsie Elliott and Gaddison Jones. And they're the young folks here in the back. They came to Sioux City in 1925 and played and danced here at the Orpheum. And they were playing with Hal Fisher's orchestra, which was a jazz/dance band from California. And so they were quite a sensation in the early to mid 1920s. Now, the first superstar of recorded jazz music in America was Paul Whiteman, and of course, you couldn't picture a less cool guy. He kind of looks like me, and so Paul Whiteman he was somebody that had been in music, and he was more almost like a music professor, but he was a very sharp musical guy. And so he had a band for a while, a big band, and it had all kinds of instruments. And eventually it became 30 or 40 pieces. It was a very large group, the definition of the big band. And it included all kinds of strings and brass and woodwinds and everything you could think of. But he loved jazz, though, from the time that he first heard it. His big thing is he wanted to be able to write it down, and and to kind of organize it more like classical and earlier forms of music. And so he did do that. But Whiteman by 1925 was a superstar in America, and he came here to Sioux City, and his band played at Central High School's auditorium, which I kind of find been some interesting concerts at Central High School's auditorium. Whiteman played there a couple of times, at least 3 times actually. It came to Sioux City and played at other venues as well. So Whiteman's band was in and out a few times. And then just as a sidelight, when Hank Williams Sr. played in Sioux City in 1950, he played at the Central High School auditorium too. And so I thought that was kind of neat. But that's kind of a fun idea, because they did have a big auditorium in that building. And so I thought that was kind of fun. Instead of playing at the downtown auditorium or at the Orpheum Theater, they played it at Central High School. Now, here we're back to Eddie Bunt. He was still going in 1926. And so this is a pretty, I included this because of this particular venue. It was in what was called the Bennett Block. And earlier we saw the West Hotel. The Bennett Block was just to the north of it on the same side of the street. So this is the West Hotel and this is the Bennett Block. And by this point, it had been called Bennett's Hall, was a dance hall going back quite a while. By this point, though, it was called Winter Garden. And that was another really active dance venue in Sioux City. Usually when you're looking for a photo, you don't actually find the exact time period, but the little sign here does say Winter Garden, so that's when this was active. So this is a place that a lot of bands would play. Now, probably the first African American act, national African American act, that was a recording, active and successful recording interest to play in Sioux City was Jesse Stone and the Blue Serenaders when they came to town in 1927 and played at the Roof Garden. And so at this point, there had been black acts that had come to Sioux City and played jazz, but they were mostly of the kind of the comic variety. And so I do want to, when I said earlier that jazz in part developed out of minstrel music, that there was a lot of a comedy aspect of that. And some of it was pretty stereotypical and not, today, not, and even at that time, not, the easiest to, it was demeaning to some extent. But if you think about it, there's been a long tradition. For instance, the Harlem Globetrotters, or here in Sioux City, we had the Sioux City Ghost softball teams they were like very skilled, but they had a comic aspect to it. And a lot of the groups that had come here before had been more of that variety. For instance, there was a group called the Alabama Troubadours that had been here that were like that. But the Serenaders, they were like a straightforward jazz band, and they didn't have a comic aspect of it, and so that was kind of a big thing in Sioux City to have that. That was kind of a landmark for Sioux City. Now we get to we'll pick up on the radio story. So in 1927, the Sioux City Journal newspaper bought the Davidson Brothers WEAU radio, and they made it KSCJ. So that by that point in our part of the country, the AM radio stations were supposed to start with a K, the federal government said, and then SCJs for Sioux City Journal. So that's how that name came about. And so their first headquarters were in this building. It was on Douglas Street, which was right next to where the Sioux City Journal's main building was, which was at the southwest corner of 5th and Douglas Streets, and it's where the big parking garage is over there. So this building was right on the alley to the south of that. And so at that point, then KSCJ for many years was Sioux City's main radio station. And again, they had all kinds of live music going on. And one of their most popular early acts were the Sioux City Journal Newsboys Band. And they loved jazz, and they played all the time. And so these were actually guys that worked for the Sioux City Journal, but played music. And in fact, the Monahan Post Band had been partly developed out of the Newsboys Band. And that was a tradition in newspapers. A lot of newspapers around the country had bands that rose to some prominence. And so this was our version of that. Now, here's another dance venue that we haven't talked about yet. It was called Alpine Dance Hall, and I'd actually never heard of this until I was putting this together. And this building was up at 11th and Nebraska Streets, the southwest corner, and it was purposely built as a grocery store in the bottom. In fact, later on, the Boulevard grocery store got its start, or was located in this building. But the upper floors of it were purposely a dance hall. And in fact, when it was built, it was made with they called a springy maple floor. And so they wanted it to be springy for the dancing activity. They said, just like Chicago and Portland. And so it was very active for all through into the 1940s, at least, as a dance hall. And this is a local group, Everett Hubbs, his Troubadour Dance Band, and they were pretty active in the Sioux City area through the late 20s through the 1930s. Now we get back to the Monahan Post American Legion Band. They in 1927 or 1928 formed their own purpose jazz band, and so this is their jazz band component of their big military band. Oddly, Don Reitz, who I mentioned earlier, he wasn't part of this because he already had his own successful orchestra outside of the Monahan Post Band. So. Other guys played in that, but here they were going to play at Winter Garden for a dance. Now, of course, connected to this, jazz inevitably led to the Jazz Singer, which was a play that got made into the first talking or sound movie in 1927. And it was, it was a sensation nationally, but it was first played at the Capitol Theater, which by that time had been the Orpheum Vaudeville that we saw earlier. And that was the theater that sat right here about where we are today. And so in this picture, this is after it had become the Capitol. And so Al Jolson was the star, and Jolson was known, kind of came out of that minstrel, only a white guy oftentimes would appear in blackface and such, but he was the star of it, and this played a solid year straight in Sioux City, and then it went to other, kind of like the Hip Theater, which was kind of like the cheap theater in Sioux City at the time, and it played there another year, and then a couple of years later it came back to Sioux City and played, and so it was a big deal, and of course all themed around the idea of jazz music by this point, jazz had already become a part of the fabric of American culture. Now here's Jesse Boone's Royal Knights, and this is a local group, a local African-American group, but you can see this when I was talking about some of the earlier acts, the African-American acts that had played jazz, they were oftentimes more of the comic variety, and you can see the Royal Knights, but they're kind of dressed up like jesters. I wish I had a clearer picture. I had to take it from the newspaper, but they were by all accounts a very popular and great band, but that was part of their act, and they appeared on the radio and other things around here. Now, somebody that eventually here a little in coming months, we're going to have a dedicated story about war or history at high noon on Lawrence Welk. But Lawrence Welk kind of became a star here in Sioux City in a lot of ways. And so I love this. So all of us remember the Lawrence Welk show that ran in the 50s and 60s and was on PBS for years and years. But Lawrence Welk had born in North Dakota. He became a radio star in Yankton, South Dakota, and for about 10 years was just a regular act on radio there. But beginning in the late 1920s, he started playing in Sioux City all the time. And I love this ad. He was going to play at the Rigodon dance, and he's the musical cyclone, Lawrence Welk, which is exactly what I think of when I think of Lawrence Welk, and the tornado of jazz. And but anyway, but undeniably a super popular act, and gave many people a start to their careers. And he was one of the first people to play at the Rigodon. And the Rigodon was a purpose-built dance hall that was right on the north side of the Insurance Exchange building. In fact, it was only torn down a couple of years ago. But that was built in 1928, and Welk played there a year later. Now, the first African-American jazz star of national prominence that played in Sioux City was Earl Hines, Father Hines, and he's one of the people that are in our photo exhibit. But he came and played at the Rigodon, so at that same place that Lawrence Welk played on, in 1932. And the Great Depression was terrible for everybody, economically, and it was for these bands as well. So a lot of especially the prominent African-American acts, whether it was Louis Armstrong or Earl Hines or any other of the big acts at that time, they were largely, they would have residency at a big club in New York or Chicago, and there wasn't much chance of seeing them. They weren't really traveling bands. They were kind of exclusive to one specific place, and the Great Depression kind of forced them to get out on the road, and that's when Sioux City started to get some of the big acts in Sioux City. And within another year, Cab Calloway, another big superstar who had been prominent in New York City for a long time, came to Sioux City and played one of the first big acts, and certainly the first big jazz act to play at what was called the New Orpheum Theater. And of course, that's the Orpheum we know today at the southeast corner of 6th and Pierce Streets. And that opened in 1927. And so that was where Cab Calloway played in 1933. And then this is one of my favorites. So Duke Ellington, of course, one of the other, probably outside of Louis Armstrong, the biggest name in early jazz for sure, and came to Sioux City in 1933 to play at the Orpheum. And Duke Ellington had the greatest advertisements. This is just tremendous. So in 1933, this was after Franklin Roosevelt had taken office and the New Deal had been instituted. So worked in the Orpheum was the NRA symbol, the eagle, and of course a great caricature of Ellington. And he was always so elegant, and so his ads always were that way. And so I think that was great. And he appeared here with his vocalist Ivy Anderson during that time. And Ellington would play here in Sioux City several times over the years. Through the 1960s, Ellington his band played here in Sioux City. Now, here's another local band that played in Sioux City for decades, and that's Brownie Walters and his orchestra. And Brownie is right here toward the back. And in fact, I found newspaper articles in 2000 where Brownie Walters was still playing acts here in Sioux City. So he was active for a long, long time. But in this case, they were going to play at Teutonia Hall. And I didn't have a good picture of it, so I had to use this aerial. It was on Jennings Streets. So just to the north of where the convention center is today. And it was this building. So this was the German culture, the German ethnic club, the Teutonia clubs building, and they had dances there all the time. And so that was the place where they played. It was this building right here. Another really popular local group during the 1930s was Jack Reams and his Metz Bakers Orchestra. And of course, they were sponsored by Metz Baking Company, and they played on KSCJ all the time. And so I'm pretty sure Jack Reams is this fellow right here on the edge. And at this time in 1934, they were going to play at the Riverside Boat Club. And Sioux City had these big boat clubs along the Big Sioux River since the 1880s. And so there was the Riverside Boat Club, there was the Sioux City Boat Club, there was the Council Oak Boat Club, and there was the Shore Acres Boat Club. And the bands played at those, and they were all along the Big Sioux River, and they played there all the time. Now, here we go. So in 1935 was kind of a watershed year because that was the year that Tom Archer, who had started the Roof Garden on the Commerce Building, that's when he bought what had been the Shore Acres Boat Club. It was originally the Commercial Men's Boat Club, and we know it today as the Sioux City Community Theater. And in 1935, he converted that into a dance hall. That was his outdoor dance venue. So the Roof Garden was his indoor dance venue for the winter months, and then Shore Acres was his outdoor dance venue for the summer months. And one of the first big acts to play there was Horace Heidt and his Californians. And Horace Heidt was very big on radio and even early television. But they were kind of the epitome of they were the big band. They were what they called the sweet bands, and Lawrence Welk's band would be that as well. And so they did have a jazz element to them, but they were much more into pop, more middle of the road type songs, but things that people loved to dance to, and of course played a lot of waltzes and things like that. And so that's where they were playing. And from this point on, Shore Acres was a primary place people played jazz music. Now, here's probably the most obscure place I found. I just had to put it in. It was so Fred Baker's orchestra. So Fred Baker was a local African-American band leader who had a band for years in the 1920s, 1930s. And in 1936, he was going to play at Japanese Garden, and I'd never heard of this place. It was out. So this is the only way I could show this to you was it was on. So this is Leeds. This is what was the International Milling Company right along. This would be Highway 75. And so today the Icky Nickel would be right here. And if you continued on the road on 41st Street all the way to 120th Street, which is the gravel road, the first one you would hit if you kept going out, There is to this day. I'm just guessing, but there's a big bank of trees where there's not a house there, and I think maybe that's where it was. It would be awesome if somebody actually knew this for sure. But there were dances there all the time in the 1930s into like the World War I or World War II era, and then it kind of disappears. But that was the most obscure place I found where jazz was played. Now we get to another local band that was around for decades, and that was Don Oliver and his band. And Don Oliver's the drummer, and he was a Central High School graduate, and I think he worked for the electric company most of the time, but this was, a lot of these local bands, they had regular day jobs, but this was their weekend and evening side gig that they did for years, and Don Oliver's band played all kinds of things. They would play birthday parties and things like that, but they were regulars at Shore Acres or at the Skyline Ballroom or wherever they needed, wherever there was a dance to be played. And so in this case, they were playing at Alpine Hall at 11th and Nebraska Streets. Now, another huge act that came to Sioux City in the 1930s was Jimmy Dorsey and his orchestra. Of course, the Dorsey brothers were some of the most famous big band leaders. It was Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, who we'll talk about here in just a bit. But Jimmy Dorsey's band, he was a saxophonist, came in 1937. Jimmy and Tommy had broken up by this point and started their own bands. And they came and played at Shore Acres in 1937. And so by this point, you're getting pretty big acts out at Shore Acres. Now, Tom Archer renamed the roof garden the Skyline Ballroom in 1938, and so it was called the Skyline from that point on. And during the winter months, that's where all the big acts would come play. And so this is a great picture that we have of Lawrence Welk's orchestra playing at the Skyline. That's actually, most of these photos I've been showing you are just kind of generic photos because that's all I could get. But this is actually them at the Skyline with the big crowd. And this is Lois Best, who was one of his singers at that time, and she was called the Champagne Lady, and that's because by this time Lawrence Welk was known for his champagne music, because somebody had said his music was so bubbly that it was just like champagne, and so that was what was going on there. Now, here, to my knowledge, this is the only time Ella Fitzgerald ever played in Sioux City. I could be wrong about this, but this was pretty early in her career. She had just risen to national prominence, and she came to the Skyline Ballroom in 1939. And at this point, she was still with Chick Webb's orchestra, and Chick Webb was one of the great jazz bands from New York, from Harlem, and they were the resident band at the at one of the big ballrooms there, at the Savoy Ballroom, I think. And Chick had a condition, a spinal condition. He had just passed away at quite a young age, but she toured with his orchestra for several years after his death. And one of the first places they played was Sioux City after Chick had passed away. Now, here's where Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra, so the other Dorsey brother, came to Sioux City in 1940. And what's funny about this is like in January of 1940, and this is just before Frank Sinatra joined Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. He was still with Harry James. And so Sioux City came this close to having Frank Sinatra sing in Sioux City. And in this picture, I think this is Frank right here when he's, about 25 years old or so, but just after. So just a couple of months later, Frank joined Tommy Dorsey because he upped his pay from like $75 a week to $100 a week or something like that. Now, probably the biggest act during this period to play in Sioux City was the Glenn Miller Orchestra. And in 1940, just before America got into World War II, Glenn Miller's orchestra was really the biggest band in the United States. And even his ad says America's #1 band. And good promotion. But Glenn Miller, he was from Clarinda, Iowa, so from southern Iowa. And he just was one of the the Glenn Miller band, or Glenn Miller Orchestra, still exists. But unfortunately, Glenn Miller was killed during World War II in 1944. He was plane crash. His plane crashed in the English Channel, but his orchestra continued and played in Sioux City many, many times afterwards, but with other leaders. Now, here's a fun local group, June Soyces All-Girl Orchestra. They're kind of a fun group because June was an accordion player, and they had a flute, and they had a banjo. They had an interesting lineup. And you see, they played all kinds of events all around Sioux City for years. They were really active in the 30s and 40s. And one of the places they played was at the Hotel Jackson, which was right across the street from us at the southeast corner of 5th Street and Jackson Street, where the parking ramp is today. Now, another big national orchestra that played in Sioux City was Sammy Kaye and his orchestra, and his orchestra played in Sioux City many times, but they played at Shore Acres in 1941. And again, Sammy Kaye, they played some jazz, but they were too kind of part of the sweet band style, but definitely a dance band. Here's another local group that played for many years in Sioux City. That was Don Perry's Iconian Dance Orchestra, and Don Perry was the drummer. And in fact, we have Don Perry's drum set in our collection. His wife Genevieve, who lived to be I think 106 years old, donated those back when I was first with the museum about 20 years ago. And so we do have his. So this picture came with that. So they're playing. They're playing at an event, and one of the places they were known to play was the Bellevue Ballroom up on Summit Street. And so they were another group that was around a long time. Now, the first time Louis Armstrong played in Sioux City was in 1942. And of course, Louis Armstrong, born in New Orleans, really was in many ways at the very foundation of what jazz music became in the 1920s, 1930s, and after. From what I could find, though, the first time he came here was in 1942, and he played at Shore Acres. But Louis then afterwards played in Sioux City many times. He played at Shore Acres several times later in the 40s and in the 1950s and into the 1960s, so quite late in his career. And he also played at other venues like the Skylon and the Tomba Ballroom. So he was somebody that had a pretty strong connection to Sioux City after his first appearance here. And Duke Ellington, I had to add this one back. So as I said, Duke Ellington came back many times as well, but he had another great ad here in the music note, and so I couldn't resist putting that back in. So Lionel Hampton and his orchestra, who's another one that's featured in the photo exhibit. He had one of the really great rhythm jazz bands. And what was funny about Lionel, and he popularized the vibraphone as an instrument in jazz, which is kind of a different instrument, and ended up playing not only with his own orchestra, but on many other people's orchestras. For instance, when we get to Benny Goodman here in a bit, Benny Goodman really broke some ground in 1937 or so when he hired Lionel Hampton to do some recording and even live performing with him. And at that time, it was kind of no-go for white and black musicians to play, for instance, in a live setting. And so that was quite groundbreaking, and Lionel Hampton was part of that. Another guy from the Benny Goodman band was Gene Krupa, perhaps one of the more famous jazz drummers of all time. But he definitely came to prominence drumming for Benny Goodman's band. But by the mid-1940s, he had his own band, and he came and played at the Skylon in 1945. Now here we have in 1945 also Woody Herman's band, and so Woody Herman had a really kind of they were one of the bluesier bands of the big band ilk, and Woody Herman had many different versions of his band over the years. This is fairly early on. In the 1950s, he started calling it the Thundering Herd, Woody Herman's Thundering Herd, and in fact, in Frank Sinatra's Main Event live album in 1974, it's the Thundering Herd or his backing band on that album, and so they were still quite active in the 1970s, and they played in Sioux City quite a few times in the 1940s and 1950s. Now we have Count Basie. The first time that he played in Sioux City was in 1945. And Count Basie, again, another one of the real legends of especially hardcore jazz music, I would call it. And he he was born in New Jersey and really started his career in the New York area and then in Chicago, but eventually made his way to Kansas City. And when he was kind of discovered and became a big star, he was playing in Kansas City. And so he kind of became the guy that was known for the Kansas City sound. And he was somebody, for instance, that Frank Sinatra worked with many times, recorded 2 whole albums with him and one of his live albums. So he had his band had a very diverse career over time. And so in 1945, they played at the Skylon. And after that point, Basie played here a few times. And of course, one of my favorite moments for Count Basie is in the movie Blazing Saddles, where Gene Wilder and Levon, where they come across him playing out in the desert, and it's Count Basie's orchestra. So in 1946, Jack Teagarden's orchestra came and played at Shore Acres. Now, Jack Teagarden goes back. He got his start with Paul Whiteman's orchestra in the late 1920s. He played with Bix Beiderbecke, the great cornetist from Davenport, that played with Whiteman as well and became one of the legends of early jazz and died at a young age. But Teagarden played in Sioux City a few different times and later became a member of Louis Armstrong's All-Star group in the 1950s that played in Sioux City at later points. Now, in 1946, Tom Archer sold the what was called the Skylon on the Commerce Building, and that became a warehouse for a while. And so he needed an indoor venue, and so he purchased the old City Auditorium and renamed it the Tomba Ballroom. And so that from that point on, that became, for about 10 years, that became the primary indoor winter venue for jazz music. And so here we have Don Oliver's band again that were scheduled to play at the Tomba. Now, locally, a guy that was probably the most important local jazz musician and just promoter of jazz music was Clarence Kinner. And Clarence Kinner came from Kansas City to Sioux City in 1935. He had met and played with Louis Armstrong in the 1920s already, and they had actually quite a close relationship. But Clarence played, his band played in Sioux City all the time, all through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And later, he was also the owner of the 7-Eleven Club that we'll get to here right at the end. But here he is. He was playing, at this time, he was playing events at Dick's Bar, which was on 4th Street over where the convention center is today. Here's another great ad for Clarence Kinner's trio, and they were playing at the Boiler Room, which was owned by John and Joseph Piro, who were the children of Lithuanian immigrants, and that were pretty big in the dance music area in the late 1940s. Now, Nat King Cole came to Sioux City in 1949, and this is just when he was coming to really national prominence with his trio, which included Oscar Moore and Johnny Miller, and they played at Central High School. They were another big act that played at Central High. Here we have Artie Shaw, who was one of the great kind of straight jazz players. He came and played at the Tomba Ballroom in 1949. Harry James, who had given Frank Sinatra his start as a vocalist, was one of the great trumpet players of the 1930s and 1940s. Came to Sioux City, and actually came to Sioux City several times, but played at for the first time he came in 1950 to the Tomba. Now, in 1950, the Sioux City Municipal Auditorium was built, that still exists today. And one of the first big acts was Spike Jones and his City Slickers. And Spike Jones was a very prominent comedian on radio and then on early television. And so he called his review the Music Depreciation Review of 1951. And but they did play jazz music in addition to kind of making fun of all things show business. Another big act at the Municipal Auditorium was Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians. And Fred Waring had been around since the 1920s, and he had a huge show. It was on the radio and on early television. As you can see, he had his band. He also had a huge choir that would go along. But they dabbled in jazz music as well, in addition to all this choral music and such. Very much along the Lawrence Welk lines, how his band developed. Now, Benny Goodman came to Sioux City for the first time in 1952, and he came specifically to play with the Sioux City Symphony. And so this wasn't with his orchestra; it was he on his own. But Benny Goodman really is he's the one that popularized swing music. So in 1936, and so kind of a more harder edge dance music that emerged, and really was kind of the popular dance music all through the late 30s and through the 1940s, and just in many ways, Benny Goodman was important, especially in integrating bands and promoting black artists and such. Another big act that came was the Stan Kenton Orchestra, and Stan Kenton was an interesting musical figure, but he really promoted all kinds of artists in his band. And to my knowledge, this is the only time Dizzy Gillespie ever played in Sioux City was with Stan Kenton in 1950. Was it 1953? So Dizzy Gillespie was part of this. Stan Getz, the great saxophonist, and then the vocalist June Christie was part of that. Now, in 1955, Tom Archer remodeled Shore Acres and made it an indoor venue. So it kind of the building that it is today. He added the whole front part here that's the front part of the building. And so at that point, then, Shore Acres became a year-round venue. And what had been the Tomba Ballroom was sold to what was called KVTV at that time, later became KCAU Television. And so from that point on, for many years, then that was KCAU's, was their studio. And so then the Shore Acres, so the kind of the live music scene on a big scale was getting smaller and smaller, kind of between Shore Acres and the Municipal Auditorium by the mid-1950s, and some acts at the Orpheum also. But at this case, Wayne King and his orchestra were playing there. And so Wayne was from Chicago, and it was based in Chicago, and played in Sioux City a whole bunch of times. Now, here's a West 7th Street club called Club 51, and I didn't have an historic photo, but the building's still there. It's right next to Bernie's Lawn and Garden Care. For many years, it was Mount Sinai Holiness Church, but it's this little building here. And that was Jack Page and Clarence Kenner's 51 Club, or Club 51. It started in 1951, and it was a no-liquor club. So in the 1950s, there were a lot of these kind of after-hours clubs where sometimes you could bring your own beer and things like that to these kind of places, but it was a very active live music place. And also Benny Hamilton, who was a DJ at KMNS radio and had a jazz show, would broadcast live from Club 51 during the 1950s. Now, here's another local, smaller area venue that was really active in the 50s and 60s, and that was the Turin Inn, La Hacienda today at 11th and Steuben Streets. I remember growing up, it was the steak block, but it's been many things over the years. And it was a place that both local and regional artists would play. And one of our local artists that played there a lot was the Reggie Williams Trio, and he was from Sioux City. Another fun local club was the Triangle Club. And this is the little triangle-shaped building out by what's ADM elevators out at 14th and Highway 75, or Lewis Boulevard, depending on how you want to look at it. It's the building's still there. It's been remodeled many times. It's a labor union headquarters, I believe. But that was the Triangle Club, and that was a very active live music venue. And one of the people that played there a lot was Preston Love from Omaha, and he was the saxophonist up here. He had played with Count Basie also, but he was real active in the area during the 50s and 60s. Here's another fun local band. It was Darrell Warner and his orchestra. And Darrell Warner was a local businessman that had an orchestra that played for many years. And so I didn't have a very good photo of them, but they're playing here. And so they were somebody. He was later on the Sioux City School Board and things like that. Now, here we get back to Clarence Kenner. So for a little while in the early 1960s, there was a place called the Torch Room that was at 620 Market, and I believe it was this little entrance here on what today's the Folk Brothers Plumbing building. And Clarence Kenner had gotten his trio back together. And I didn't mention earlier, I'm not sure who Harry was in his band, but Ash was Ashnell Bazette. Who was Clarence Kenner's stepson, and was very prominent in local music as well. Now, Ray Charles came to Sioux City in 1963, and we usually think of Ray Charles as an R&B and soul artist, which he was basically the originator of especially soul music. But he also, lesser known is that he was very much recorded jazz all throughout his career. Now this happened when he came to Sioux City in 1963. This is just after he put out his modern sounds and country and western music that had made him a superstar internationally. And so he came to Sioux City at a very at a height of his popularity, so I thought that was interesting. And then another local venue that was active in the 60s was called the Brewery in the old Sioux City Brewing Company building. It was at West First and Isabella. Today, Hamilton Boulevard goes right through this area. And Earl Hines came back to Sioux City in 1967 to play at the Brewery, so I thought that was great, way at the beginning of the story and toward the end. Here we get back to Sammy Kaye. In 1967, Sammy Kaye was one of the guys that came back to Sioux City to play for the Rivercade celebration that year, and so here's his orchestra. And that kind of dance, big band music was popular through the 1960s. A lot of people think that died after World War II, but it really didn't. It was pretty popular, especially with older people, of course. Al Hurt, who was a great trumpeter in the Dixieland jazz style, more of a traditional style, came and played at the auditorium in 1967. And then the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, which still exists, it's gone through many iterations over the years, came and were one of the first big acts to play at Epley Auditorium after it was built out on the Morningside College campus in 1967. And then I had to mix in some of our prominent rock and rollers. So Patch of Blue, which was one of Tommy Bolin right here, his early bands. They were always into jazz. A lot of the young guys here in Sioux City were big-time jazz aficionados in addition to rock and rollers. And so what I love, they got to play a gig in late 1967 at the Orpheum Theater, and they specifically called themselves a jazz R&B and R&B group. And I thought that was, or I guess jazz and rhythm and blues group. That's what they call themselves. And I thought that was kind of interesting for a local rock and roll band. And then I love this. So the 7-Eleven Club, which was at 711 West 7th Street, this was originally a kind of a warehouse section for Western States Manufacturing Company, but Clarence Kenner started this in the early 1960s, and that was a live music venue through the 1980s. And one of the people I associate with it is Russell Bazette, who's the tall guy right here when he was in high schooler, already dressing pretty cool. But he was a friend of Tommy Bolin's and indeed played with Tommy Bolin in the 1970s on a professional level. But Russell Bazette to this day is still a pretty, he's played on many, many albums and played live, both jazz and rock, and so has had quite a career in music since that time. And Russell is the son of Ashnell Bazette that I pointed out earlier. And then finally, we finish up in 1969 with the Sioux City Slickers, who are a local Dixieland jazz band, and they would play at places like the Grandview Park Band Shell, and so more of a traditional New Orleans style jazz band. And that's it. I kind of thank you very much.